Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
I'm really excited to kick off this event tonight, and I'm just going to introduce the topic briefly and then introduce our speakers. So social justice is a bad word for some American Christians these days. It reeks of socialism, of the effort of the government to intrude upon individual freedoms or to replace charity with government programs. A well-known cable talk show host not long ago warned people of faith against the introduction of social justice into church sermons and church programs. It was, he told them, a way in which liberals sneak into the church and pull the wool over people's eyes. And yet, it is arguable that, at least with respect to Western culture, social justice was first a Jewish and then a Christian idea. And so we read, for example, in Leviticus chapter 23, quote, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am Yahweh, your God." The prophet Zechariah said, "Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart." And Jesus told a rich young man, quote, "If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come and follow me." The letters of Paul in the New Testament make clear that such commands were not meant to be simply personal words to live by, though they were that. They were for the church, the Christian community, the koinonia, a social organism meant to go out into the world and change it together for the better. But even if it is true that social justice was a notion born out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, this does not mean that people of faith exclusively own it. Social justice is an idea that has rocked the world, and its advocates have come in all shapes and sizes, from various faiths and non-faiths. Atheists, theists, pantheists, and agnostics alike have claimed for themselves the cause of social justice. The question before us tonight is a relationship between faith, especially the Christian faith, and social justice. Why should we care about social justice? Is faith a help or an hindrance to the cause of social justice? Is faith or non-faith merely a matter of motivation, or does it also offer a way of shaping and structuring practices and their goals? What about academic work on social justice? Is there room for a distinctly Christian academic approach to the problems of social justice? Or must people of faith check their faith at the door of the university and instead engage in rational analysis? Our speakers tonight are here as our guests to offer two different perspectives on these and similar questions. One is a Christian, the other an agnostic. One, as you will see, considers his Christian faith to be central to his work as a professor on behalf of social justice. The other draws his inspiration from other wells, so to speak, and has constructed a life and career devoted to causes of social justice quite apart from any active faith, let alone the Christian faith. Our first speaker, Professor Bill Tate, is the Edward Mallinckrodt Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Education and soon to be Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. His research focuses on youth and education, especially in urban communities, where he has worked to understand the factors that shape student success in math and science, as well as the keys to overall social development of young people in urban communities. Our second speaker, Professor Chris Larrison, is an associate professor in the School of Social Work here at the University of Illinois. His research focuses on community-based agencies that seek to help people deal with challenges like mental illness or poverty. He's interested in what might make those agencies more effective for the people who call upon them, and how the agencies themselves function in terms of institutional culture and climate. His work has been featured on the publicized to-read lists of major organizations like the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the U.S. Government Accounting Office, and the World Bank. So we're going to start with Professor Tate, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Larrison back to back, and each will speak about 20 minutes. And then we'll have a time of question and answer, during which time you will be able to text, and the text numbers at the bottom of your brochure there, in questions, or we also will have note cards that will be passed about if you want to write a question down and then pass it in. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. For now, though, welcome with me both of our guests tonight, Dr. Tate and Dr. Larrison.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Ned, and I'd like to thank Veritas and the churches and organizations that are affiliated with this event for giving me an opportunity to come share with you. I'm a native of Chicago, Illinois, and I grew up a fan of the Illinois basketball program. For over a decade, I have been living in the St. Louis area. Missouri and Illinois fans are passionate about their basketball. The two states share other common characteristics, including strong agrarian traditions, central time zone, similar educational attainment levels, similar demographic rates of youth and senior populations, and both are geographically close. Despite being similar in many respects, there is a border, lines of demarcation that matter in terms of governance, finance, traditions, customs, and values. And yes, sports. I have attended a number of the border war basketball games between Illinois and Missouri held in St. Louis. It has always been a bit awkward for me. Is it possible to be a true fan of the Fighting Illini and the Missouri Tigers? Where is your heart when real decisions about the two teams need to be made? Do you root for one in the first half of the game and the other in the second half? This year, I witnessed a man do just that. Missouri was in control in the first half of the game. This gentleman put on his Missouri hat and cheered with great passion for the Tigers. In the second half, as Illinois made their move, he changed hats and donned the orange and navy blue of the Illini. Another man in his row at the game noticed and said, "Hey, what's up with you?" The conflicted fan responded, "I really don't care who wins. Just enjoy rooting for whoever is up." The battles in sports are fun, but not eternal in nature. Yet the concept of battle and warfare are directly related to a decision or our decisions to align with a worldview. Worldviews are in conflict. In the game of life, we have decisions to make. Our principles should not be like this fan, changing hats or changing loyalties based on circumstances. Worldviews provide borders, lines of demarcation, and perspective on theology, philosophy, biology, psychology, sociology, politics, economics, history, law, and ethics. Thus, our worldview should inform our understanding of today's topic, justice. I can relate to the fan I observed this year at the border war game. During my years as a college student, my worldview was conflicted and confused. If I were a food item at a restaurant, I would be characterized as soup du jour. Reflecting back, it seems like each day I learned and aligned with a different perspective, changing and exchanging ideas and concepts like a chameleon to fit my desires and personal agenda, rooting for the idea that would win the moment. With my friends, I would discuss Pan-Africanism and Black liberation theology. In class with my economics professors, I chatted about the superiority of capitalism and the importance of the rule of law to stability in markets. I waxed eloquently about the impending demise of communism and totalitarian governments. Throughout college, I added to my knowledge of big ideas: Darwinism, Marxism, secular humanism, and Black nationalism. In many cases, the ideas were presented to me in discrete and disconnected fashion, with my brain serving as the cognitive archaeological site. Digging for answers to important questions of life proved to be a major challenge. The core of my problem was that I had no core. My mind was working, but I did not take the time to examine the inconsistency in my thinking, because in the end, my potpourri of big ideas could be melded and fashioned to serve me. My friends loved my thinking. My professors thought I was well-read. What more could I ask for? How about the truth? How about consistency and alignment of my thinking with the truth? For nearly a decade after my undergraduate studies, I made horrible personal decisions with no core truth guiding my walk. Life was centered on professional advancement and pleasure. I was raised in a Christian family. However, I did not take the claims of Christianity faith seriously or live as if they were true. So as life challenges emerged, I applied non-Christian principles with little success. Then I would change hats like the conflicted border war fan and call out to God to help me fix my problems. However, that was all I wanted, was a fix. Ultimately, I accepted Christ as the Lord of my life. How did this happen, you may ask? I recognized the wrongdoings in my life. Persisting in these acts on my part was a product of being separated from a personal, ethical, and self-revealing God. My heart was drawn to the redemption of the world through Christ's atoning death, burial, and resurrection. I have attempted to follow the instruction in Romans 2:12, which states, "And do not conform to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." What this means in terms of worldview is that I seek to live by and be guided by the Word of God, specifically biblical Christianity. I believe the Bible is true. Because of this belief, I find reason to pursue justice. I am called by the Christian worldview to seek justice. The Old Testament has a clear theme of God's concern for justice. For example, Isaiah 1:17 calls for the follower of biblical Christianity to learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. We see in the life of Jesus a consistent, often shocking, and countercultural concern for the marginalized. Justice is foundational to biblical Christianity. As such, I am called to seek justice. I was charged to speak about how my faith and worldview influence my views on the practice of justice. In essence, how does my faith influence my day-to-day living as far as the matter of justice? Since the focus here is on my academic research, I will attend to this aspect of my life. I am a professor. Noah Webster defined the term professor in a fashion that captures who I am and what my aims are in life. This is the 1828 version. one who makes open declarations of his sentiments or opinions, particularly one who makes a public avowal of his belief in the Scriptures and his faith in Christ, and thus unites himself to the visible church. 2, one that publicly teaches any science or branch of learning, particularly an officer in a university, college, or other seminary whose business is to read lectures or instruct students in a particular branch, as a professor of theology or mathematics. I attempt to serve society by living out Webster's definition of a professor, both faith and science. I hope to be a professor able to live according to Paul's words in Philippians, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness in mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look not only for his own interests, but also the interests of others." As an endowed professor, I offer one example that aligns with this guiding scripture text for my public role. Universities today are often judged by the amount of revenue in their endowments. It is undeniable that a significant endowment can advance the university's mission. Endowments are a part of the legacy of university partnerships that date back hundreds of years. One of the first gifts endowing an academic professorship was awarded to a man who would eventually be named Bishop of Rochester, England. The professorship was established to support and advance the theological mission of Cambridge University. John Fisher was the first academic to hold the Lady Margaret Professorship. Eventually, John Fisher, a man of significant academic standing, was named Chancellor of Cambridge University, a position he maintained until his death. As a bishop, chancellor, and Lady Margaret Professor, many sought his counsel and held his scholarship in high regard. Eventually, he became advisor, some might say unfortunately, to King Henry VIII. The king's history with women and divorce is well documented. What is sometimes overlooked is that John Fisher, the Lady Margaret Professor, took a public stand against the king's efforts to declare his marriage to Queen Catherine null and void. His public position, based upon principle, ethics, and moral conviction, cost the first lady holder of the Lady Margaret Professorship at Cambridge University his life. The endowed professor was beheaded. It was not the prestige of the endowed professorship that symbolizes the legacy of John Fisher. Rather, his legacy, in part, was his willingness to publicly offer a reasoned position and to stand firm in the face of great political opposition. He looked beyond his own self-interest and defended the rights of an individual not positioned to leverage the same public forum. He considered the interests of others and acted. My hope is to grow in my public commitment to a life in Christ such that no amount of opposition would deter me from advancing the truth to others. I've been asked to speak briefly about my academic work. In order to be succinct, I offer one example of how the Bible has helped me think about the relationship between my academic work and justice. There is an exchange between Jesus and a lawyer in Luke 10, 25 through 29, that informs my academic project. The text states, "And then a certain lawyer arose to try him, saying, 'Teacher, what am I to do to inherit everlasting life?' Jesus said to him, 'What is written in the law? How do you read it?' And he replied, 'You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And Jesus said to him, 'You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live.' And he, determined to acquit himself of reproach, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" The question, "Who is my neighbor?" precedes the text to one of the great stories of all time, the Good Samaritan. Throughout recorded history, societies have attempted to document and describe their neighbors. In many cases, we record these descriptions with the hope we can intervene on poverty, social disparities, housing, mental and physical health, and many other problems involving the human condition. Psychology, sociology, economics, epidemiology, political science, and many other disciplines are involved with informing society about their neighbors. The focus of my research and teaching has been on the political economy of urban education in STEM fields. So I'm going to deviate from this text and describe very briefly one example. So who is my neighbor in Metro St. Louis? Let me begin because I'm from Washington University, and you're not considered legitimate at Washington University unless you have what? A theory. So briefly and succinctly, the theory is as such. We all live in community with one another, and most people in communities attend our schools and our informal education opportunities. Those who do well feed back into the community positive outcomes, and those who do not do well bring negative outcomes both to schools and communities. That's pretty well established. If you have a negative outcome, generally speaking, you're associated with social costs. The government has to intervene. They call it prison, welfare, etc. I don't have my glasses on, so if I make sure, is this the negative sign? Yeah. Is that the positive sign? No. Negative, good. I can't see a thing, so I'm going on memory, all right? And so these are our negative outcomes related to when folks are in the community, they don't do well in school, they drop out, and they come back as a cost to our community. That's a very bad function. Things aren't good there. When you're in school and things go well, you have lots of positive school and non-school factors that work well. You end up at places like the University of Illinois and Washington University. And you can contribute to society in a couple of ways. Number one, your social capital goes into the workforce, and it ends up with lots of positive benefits in terms of family support, tax revenue, etc. You are plus in our community. You add money, jobs, etc., and the cycle continues. The dilemma is this part is extremely hard to intervene on, the negative cycle. And it's where most of us spend our time of thinking about how we're going to help people who find themselves in ultimately what ends up to be a cycle of poverty and, unfortunately, generally negative contribution to community. So I live in a city that is one of the most fragmented politically in the United States. It's, I believe, let me go back. I believe it's the third most fragmented behind Pittsburgh and Minneapolis, St. Paul. Fragmentation is a function of segregation. So the more fragmented a community is politically, the more municipalities that exist in a metro area, the more likely you have experienced segregation. These cities, in particular St. Louis, would be considered hyper-segregated in terms of on the racial front and on the poverty front, which has implications, obviously, for the negative side of the theory I have, but we'll go on. So every community that I know of has something they want to become. In St. Louis Metro, we want to be the biotechnology hub of the world. Plant science, biotechnology, bioengineering are extremely important. So in the work I'm doing with colleagues, we realized that, and we asked questions, what opportunity do people indigenous to Central and Metro St. Louis have in terms of participating in biotechnology? If the community says they want to become something, are the people in the community actually, are they going to have access to attaining that particular aim? And so, to that end, it did not make sense to us to look at St. Louis from the perspective of the municipalities, but to rather organize our thinking about that landmass based upon where the biotechnology companies are. So there is a technique for my GIS friends, or Geographic Information System friends, called Nearest Neighborhood Index, and we mapped on all the biotechnology companies in the area and created new, what I would call regions, based upon the clustering of the companies. This statistical technique tells us that the companies are clustered. They're not randomly placed. That should not be shocking to you. Companies do not do things randomly. They actually build based upon where highways are, where other companies are of similar backgrounds. And in our case, companies want to be close to Washington University, St. Louis University, because there's a lot of biotech work going there. So there's no randomization in terms of no randomized clustering here. It's all really probably been preordained and thought through. I wasn't in the boardroom to determine that they did that, but statistically, it's just, it has to be. So here's how we now have organized our thinking about our neighbors. We based it upon where the clusters of companies are. For time's sake, I'm going to keep going. You see the sort of oval shapes, and those are our new clusters with names. And so now I can begin putting all kinds of characteristics about our community in the context of these new clusters. One thing we could do is we could look at where are the people who have earned undergraduate degrees. And if you look at it, there's a western migration. The darker color is a greater intensity of undergraduate degrees. So the further west you go, this is East St. Louis, this is your Illinois boundary, East St. Louis is here. The further west you go, the greater the concentration of undergraduate degrees. That's quite telling because many of the companies are further to the east, but folks are living out with undergraduate degrees are west. There's a suburban white flight, basically in the work we've done. It's pretty documented in St. Louis. Let me go back. Then we look at where poverty is in terms of students. It's not surprising. This is the St. Louis public school area. They have a high concentration of poverty. I can't read the numbers here. Does that say 68? 66% at least are in schools. It's just, let's be frank, that number is just a break point in GIS. It's like 90% of the schools are free and reduced lunch in the city of St. Louis. And as you go further west, that poverty rate decreases. This says something about potential opportunities to participate in biotechnology. It's not that I don't think that poor kids could actually get there, but it's clear that right now we have an attainment difference in where the companies are and what the backgrounds of the individuals are. I'm going the wrong way. And then we look at income, which also will tell us a little bit about the opportunities the individuals will have. It's not surprising you have a western migration of higher incomes. The further away from the center city you go, the higher the incomes become. Now, this is the important slide. Actually, I could have started here, some background. Into the state, because of accountability requirements, in about 2000 began offering science testing. This is a 10th grade science testing. In the region, the performance is not very strong overall, but what is, you'll notice again is a western migration in this part of the area, which is Clayton, Ladue, et cetera. They perform very, very well on the state science test. So that tells me who actually might be able to participate in the biotechnology opportunity. When you look in the central city, 10th grade, those aren't really good scores. So, what do you need to get into the University of Illinois on the ACT? 28, 29, 30. You're not going to get there with that kind of science score, okay? And so we continue. This, and I use the year 2002 for a reason. 4 years later, the state of Missouri decided that they were going to have an amendment put on the state ballot that called for funding of stem cell research, and the funding was to help incubate new companies in the clusters that I delineated for you. Now let me give you some background briefly in the time I have. The actual amendment, when analyzed in terms of the reading level, was the equivalent of a Harvard Law Review article. That was on the ballot given to citizens. Now, I have given you a bit of information about who has undergraduate degrees in the metro St. Louis area, and actually the science attainment level in 2002, so 4 years later, almost all of those students are now able to vote. And unless you think they're underperforming relative to their peers, in the United States in 2002, no other class of students in the history of this country had more access to math and science than those students did in 2002, and we continue to accelerate their access. So their parents actually may know less than the kids. And the amendment is written at the equivalent of a Harvard Law Review article in Missouri. I'm not going to spend my time talking about stem cell research. That could be for another Veritas forum. But my point is, if you're going to vote on something like that, and it's put in a context that you literally need to have gone to Harvard Law School, how can you really vote on it? What does that say about justice in our democracy when you really don't have access to the ballot because it's put in a format that's inconsistent with your educational attainment? I could go on and on about this, but I won't. I want to show you the results that happened in the metro area. In the city of St. Louis, 67% of the voters voted in favor of the amendment. And the further west you went, the lower are the percentage of voting. This is striking to me from a justice perspective. The individuals least likely to benefit from a stem cell initiative were more likely to vote for it. The individuals who were more likely to vote for it, or more likely to benefit, were least likely to vote for it. The individuals who actually could read it were least likely to vote for it. This is shocking, and in many talks when I talk about this, this is an example, in my opinion, of one group of people that are set up to be exploited. Fundamentally, their tax dollars will go for TIFs and other economic strategies that will fund this entity. It didn't pass ultimately, but would have funded it, and they would not have benefited. And the cycle, and I don't know if my next slide actually has it, the cycle that I was making reference to continues. So while many of these things are touted as helping the inner city, they actually are really not designed to do that. And this is a question of justice that I've attempted to pursue throughout my academic career. I want to understand, if we have interventions, will they actually help the people they're intended to? In the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus identifies three people: a priest, a Levite, and the Samaritan. All three see a man half dead on a road. The first two are similar in that both know the law of God, but do not live it out. There is no alignment between knowing the law and a labor of love toward a fellow human being. They have learned, but there is no labor. Learn it, but no labor. The third man labored to serve his fellow man. Christ asked, which of these three proved to be a neighbor? The lawyer responded, the one who showed mercy towards him. Then Jesus said, go out and do the same. What is the motto of the University of Illinois? Learning and labor? Many of you are part of this institution's tradition. I urge each of you to better understand the worldview guiding your life. Learn what is the fundamental basis of your desire to care for the poor and oppressed. Understand my point. I am not saying people who don't have the core of Christian faith can't care for the oppressed, but there are plenty of philosophies in the history of thought that haven't cared. I can't make the assumption that the call to care for others is universal or has a basis that can be common between different worldviews. So seek out the best worldview foundation for concern for justice, learning, Then go, show mercy to your neighbor. Labor. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to hear from Professor Chris Larrison now. Before we do that, however, I was just told that there is, in fact, a typo on your brochure for the number that you are to text with questions. So this is a significant issue. The number, it's the last digit that is incorrect. The last digit should be 5, and so the number is correct that's on the screen. It's incorrect on your printed brochure. Again, it's that last digit, the 5, that's the key difference here. Am I right about that, Tim? All right, good. So you are welcome to begin to text your questions as our next speaker is speaking, so you don't have to wait till the Q&A time to do that. But even as you're texting, make sure you're listening. All right, Professor Chris Larrison. They're over here.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to come talk. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and one that I think I've spent my life pursuing. So, oh boy, I don't have the clicker. So this is classic. Technology hates me if you just want to. Is it going up here? Oh, thanks a lot. No, I'm sorry. So yeah, technology hates me. So I really, when I sat down and I jumped a slide here, didn't I? One of the things, this is very personal to me, and I still do write letters to family, write letters to friends, and oftentimes I'll open up a letter with a quote that means something. It's sort of going to capture and embody in some meaningful way the rest of the message. And for me, tonight, this does capture the message for me. It's a quote from a song that I like very much, and I'll just say it. I've never avoided certainty. It has just eluded me. I wish I knew the truth. And that does. It fits very much with an agnostic view of the world, correct? I can't decide. So it drives me very hard, that thing. And as you start to understand a little bit of my background, you'll understand why that uncertainty drives me hard in some interesting ways. So just to give you a sense of my worldview a little bit, I view myself as really working from 4 basic core concepts that structure the way I see the world and the way that I see that we ought to approach the world, at least the way I should approach the world, maybe. And the first one being empathy, most importantly, maybe. And that, I think, is maybe, we often hear the word empathy today, but it is one of the most difficult tasks put in front of us as human beings, to place ourselves in the shoes of another in an earnest way and try to understand their point of view. Right? It's hard. Sometimes it's easy, but when somebody's very different from us and doesn't see the world in any of the same ways that we do, it's really hard. And then add into the mix if we don't like that worldview. Then it becomes almost impossible. Now, we could be edging out on postmodernism, right? Where everything, there is no evil and there is no wrong in the world. Let me just empathize with who you are. I certainly could empathize why a skinhead is a racist. If I listened to his background and how he was brought up, and the terrible background he might have had, and where it led him to. But this still doesn't leave me with, at all, sympathizing with that point of view. And that's a very interesting break from empathy. Because I might be able to empathize with you, but there's something desperately wrong with that. Moving from empathy, you have to go to compassion, I think. And compassion means moving beyond just putting myself in your shoes to actually trying to do something to make the world a better place for you. And I have up here 2 little pieces of my own life that help me understand maybe what compassion is. And the piece that says Chinese lady late for her appointment, when I was living in Georgia as a social work student, and my wife and I think that year, we lived well below the poverty line. And it was a very, very desperate time in our lives in terms of money. And I had gotten a contracting job as a PhD student to go out to a very rural setting at a Department of Family and Children's Services and help them with their evaluations. And so I was sitting in the waiting room, and they were running a little bit late. And for those, so there are some people in the room that know me, I'm late for everything. And this was one of the rare instances I was on time. So I was sitting in the waiting room, and I'm waiting, and in comes a Chinese woman who actually speaks Mandarin. And let me tell you, in 1992, in rural Georgia, this was as if a Martian had just dropped out of the sky for me. This is not like Central Illinois or on this campus. So it was a very strange moment. And this woman didn't speak any English. And it became clear as she sort of started to engage with the front desk person that she was late for her appointment. And they were not going to let her in. And she became increasingly agitated, and no English. And they said no. They kept saying no. And she really ramped it up, and then it became clear that it was going to come to an end. And I was sitting there watching this. It's me and this scene in front of me at the waiting room. And as I was watching this, I'm thinking, oh boy, this is miserable. And I'm thinking to myself, should I get up and say anything? And then I'm thinking to myself, I gotta go home and explain to my wife if I don't get this job that we don't have any money coming in. So I sat there and I sat there. And what popped into my mind, about a year before, I'd been taking a train from Bulgaria to Hungary. And you know, at the border stops, the train stops, right? And they sort of check your passport. Well, we crossed into Serbia, the border stop, it was early in the evening. I went to bed in Serbia. It was a fairly long ride to get out to Hungary. And in the middle of Serbia, in the middle of the night, the train stops again, no border stop this time. And I find myself dazed and confused on the side of a track with a whole bunch of Muslim men who I didn't know were on the train, and a bunch of armed guards, all of whom were under like 19 years old. And it was a desperate situation. Nobody said a word. Nobody spoke English. I had this big, huge beard. I looked not a whole lot different from one of these guys. And my English passport, or my U.S. passport, although interesting, could have been made up. And it left me with such a desperate feeling not to have anybody step forward for me and to sit there and sort of beg for help when nobody understood me. And it was dark, and it was the middle of Serbia, and it could have been terrible. Now, as it turns out, they put me back on the train, and that was it. So as this flashed through my mind in a second, I was like, all right, I've got to get up and say something about this poor woman. I don't know where she's come from, but how she's gotten herself to this front window, but I'm sure it took an incredible amount of energy. And so I did. I got up and I said, you're late for your appointment with me. And unless you're going to see this woman, I'm not going to see you. And you have to have this evaluation done. The dynamic changed. The woman went into her appointment. Now, in a classic Southern fashion, they took me in, and I went through the process. And at the end, I was able to go home and tell my wife, oh, this is great. I didn't even have to tell her that part of the story. I said, oh, yeah, we're going to get paid for this. It's good. It's an easy job. Now, because they were very positive when they took me in. They didn't ultimately hire me for that job. Okay. I never felt bad about it. And by the time I found out about it, the money didn't make any issue. I probably would have had to live a lot harder with myself to set if I had not done anything in that particular moment. Now, moving beyond compassion, I think it's important that we start to cooperate a little bit. And we are often just incentivized in some meaningful way not to cooperate. And what I'd like to do is present a very basic dilemma. It's called the prisoner's dilemma, and it really highlights in some meaningful way how we are trapped in ways that encourage us not to be cooperative. So if you could click that link for me. And this is about 2 minutes long. And it's a nice, it's YouTube, and it's Science Guy, I think.
Hey guys, does this day sound familiar? You go to a confusing level.
Does math suck?
The prisoner's dilemma has been studied for over 60 years for its insights into political, military, and economic affairs. It tells us that even when the best case scenario is clear, rational individuals, acting in their own self-interest, can bring about the worst case scenario. Let's see how it works. Imagine two criminals, we'll call them Xavier and Yoshi, who robbed a bank. They got caught. As a prosecutor, I don't have enough evidence to convict them, so I need a confession. I separate the two, then offer each a deal. I tell Xavier, if you confess and turn Yoshi in, I'll let you go free. But if you don't confess and he turns you in, you'll take the fall and get 10 years in jail. Xavier, being a bright bank robber, wonders what happens if they both turn on each other. In that case, Mr. X, each of you will go to prison for 8 years. And if we both stay silent, Xavier asks, I can still get you on a lesser charge, a month each for weapons possession. I walk across the hall and offer Yoshi the exact same deal. I even tell him that I'm repeating the offer I made to Xavier. Here's the catch. Xavier and Yoshi can't coordinate with one another. If they could, they would certainly cooperate and keep their mouths shut, accepting a month in jail against the prospect of a decade. But taken in isolation, the rational bank robber will turn his partner in. Consider it from Yoshi's point of view. He's thinking, either Xavier will cooperate and keep his mouth shut, or he'll defect and he'll turn me in. If he cooperates and I cooperate too, we get the best overall outcome, a month each in jail. Yet that still sends me to jail. If I defect, I get off scot-free. On the other hand, he could defect and confess what we've done. If that happens and I stay silent, I get 10 years in jail. If I defect as well, I get only 8 years. So no matter what Xavier does, Yoshi is better defecting and turning his partner in. Xavier, of course, is going through the exact same scenario in his head and coming to the conclusion that no matter what Yoshi does, he should defect and turn him in. Here's the mischievous pickle I put them in. The best case scenario is clear. They should both stay silent. But rational considerations will lead both to turn the other one in, leading to a worst case scenario. The classic real-life example is nuclear deterrence. It's better to cooperate and avoid the risk and expense of maintaining giant nuclear stockpiles. But logic has led us to a world with thousands of weapons at the ready. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Michael Moyer.
So cooperation is incredibly important, and we are often incentivized, as in the prisoner dilemma, not to cooperate, right? The best possible outcome is to defect. You don't go to jail at all. And that's often the case that happens, particularly if there is the bottom piece, this opportunity, which is the last part that I think is important here. And really opportunity means to create an environment that allows for social justice to occur. And I think that that comes about through communication. And thinking about the prisoner's dilemma in particular, right? Every time, if you communicate, why wouldn't you cooperate? There's no upside to not cooperating. Okay. So those basic concepts, core concepts, really define in some meaningful way my worldview and then drive me as I pursue social justice in some meaningful way. I keep waiting for somebody else to do the slide. So, where do I get this from? Inevitably, right, our families play significant roles in who we are. And my family background is one of interest. I come from a father who came from great privilege and a mother who was first generation immigrant, Sicilian. Her father was a ditch digger, my grandfather, all of his life. He couldn't read above a third grade level. So a very diverse background. And my mother remembers, and certainly her father remembered, the slurs that were used against the Italian immigrants, particularly those who were working class. And it was something that moved my mother very hard in terms of who she was, and in turn, it moved us. Now, one of the things that came with privilege was we were all sent to camp. We'd go to summer camp every summer for the whole summer. And the theme of my camp, which I send my son now to, is The Other Fellow First. And it was a camp that was filled with kids from right outside the city, so kids with even more privilege than I had, typically. And the camp spent the whole summer trying to convince us, other fellow first. Never left. remains a centerpiece of who I am. And I was no saint, let me assure you. I was the kid that shoved in line. I was the kid that wanted to be first. I was the kid that wanted everything. And to be in a place all summer long where you could watch other kids who also wanted to be first and have the first piece of candy and do everything, turning around and doing the other fellow first was a very powerful event. Now, as an agnostic, it's particularly interesting that number 2 on the list is religion, correct? It played a huge role in who I was, all right? Being who my mother was, I went to Catholic church every Sunday. I started Catholic school, all boys school. I cried all 6th grade summer about having to go to Catholic boys school starting in 7th grade. I didn't leave Catholic school system until I was a freshman in college, where they thought maybe it was not a great setting for me and I should move on. But the people that taught me during those years, the Jesuits, the Christian Brothers, were some of the most committed people to social justice I've ever met. And I think in many ways they sowed the seeds of moving away from the Catholic Church through this heavy commitment to social justice that was very interesting. Now, I have down there the fight. So as committed this school was that I went to in middle school and high school to social justice, and they did. They took in a number of inner city kids, right, on scholarship, and they were African American kids. Now, never thought anything about application or racism. I lived in a very white neighborhood. I really didn't know any other African Americans other than the kids that I saw at school. And given the social and economic distance between us and the fact that they lived in the city and I lived out in the burbs meant that I had very little interaction with them. Now, one day at school, which is not unusual, a fight broke out. And anybody that went to Catholic school knows, right? They intervened very quickly, and it came to a very quick end. But the two competitors, a black kid and a white kid, as often is the case, decided we're going to duke it out after school. And the news went around the school. And this turned into some big event. And in classic Catholic school fashion, we're going to meet out at St. Mary's Cemetery. Right? So here you go, whatever, I go see this, and so I get in my car, and I drive over there, and sure enough, there's all the white kids in this, and it really, this was not a fight that had a racial component. These were two kids that had some other gig going on, all right? But the split was there. I looked around. There wasn't any of the black kids there. I was like, where's that? And the cemetery is filled with cars. And then up comes the public bus, stops at the cemetery entrance, and off the bus rolls all the African-American kids for the fight. And I thought, boy, it's interesting to talk about this in class, but rarely do you see this. How separate are we? How little we interact with each other? How little we know about each other? Now, education. And I have nothing but very good feelings about my Catholic education. It was something that meant a lot to me, and I think it is a deep underpinning. And one of the things that makes me a little bit anxious about my own children, my kids don't go to the Catholic Church, they're not going to do the sacraments, and I do the job of teaching social justice in the way that the Jesuits did for me, but is this going to be enough? Because certainly the public schools are not going to do this in the same way that the Jesuits do it, and I don't expect them to. But so is there something that's going to be missed? Can I convey the message of social justice in the same way that these people did in this very powerful way for me? So it's a question that I have. Okay. Education. I moved from being a freshman at a small Catholic school and being asked by the head of the school to maybe move on, and I moved on to Cornell. And so I went on to an Ivy League school, which was much bigger in a very different setting. And again, another setting of great privilege, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And at one point in the middle of this, a girlfriend said, you know, you talk about race and ethnicity and caring about people who are poor. There's this guy, Jacob Hope, he's coming up on the campus. You're going to come to this with me. So really? This is a Saturday afternoon. We could be doing 1,000 better things than going to see this guy talk. So if you could click on that link right there. So Jacob showed up, And if you could just scroll down a little bit. Yeah, keep scrolling down, you just bring some. So Jacob showed up, and his lecture was something like 6 or 7 hours. People got up and left. And as people got up and left, he said, "You think this is oppressive? You should see what it's like to live in the South and be black. Sit, stay until I'm done, because whatever oppression you feel today is nothing what other people are feeling." He did. He was a guy who, classic, the Swedes do this, Jacob Riis, most famously, right, in old school, taking pictures of the slums in New York City. Well, Jacob Hope replicated that. He came here without a cent in his pocket and hitchhiked around the United States, and particularly the southern United States in the 80s, taking photos. And it was an amazing experience to hear him talk and to see these photos that were from 1980. It looked like something that you would read out of history books about the Deep South. And to think it was happening today, or at least in 1980, was incredible. And to see somebody that was so committed to actually doing something about this was particularly moving. And has never left me. I've run across Jacob Hope one other time, and he's very distinctive. He has a very long braided beard, and in the 80s, not very many people, maybe more people are doing this today, but not very many people, so you would be able to spot him. And every time, the 2 times I've ever spotted, I saw him at a demolition derby once in Utica. I came right over him. I said, "Jacob, you know, you've had a huge impact on my life." And he's a very shy guy. But it is something, his photos are incredibly moving. I encourage you to go look at it. His book is called American Pictures. Along with that education really comes my social work education. And in social work, in many ways, we are a profession that is meant to reach out to the oppressed of the world and to seek social justice with them. And as a result, we have an inner debate that is very interesting, has gone on since 1915. So if we go back to the slide, it's gone on since in 1950, social workers asked, are we a profession or are we a calling? Because who typically works with the poor? 1915. Was there a large professional social welfare system in state? No, it was the religious organizations. Fleckner's conclusion in 1915 was, no, you're not really a profession. You may become one in the future, but primarily you're a calling. And when you ask today, if you ask somebody that's about 10 years older than me in social work, what did you do? A man. Ask a man before. 10 years, maybe in his late 50s, mid 60s. What did you do before social work? A lot of times you'll hear they were in the seminary. So social work opened up a way to pursue social justice, and particularly feminism opened up a way for men to pursue social justice beyond traditional religious organizations. Finally, my profession itself has been filled with more than one can imagine in some ways, with instances of injustice. All day long in social work, you often are dealing with injustice that there's little you can do about. And I have up here the counseling session. When I was a therapist in Georgia, I had an African-American couple come in. I'd just been married myself. I had no kids. This was a middle-aged couple. They came into my office because I was up on the waiting list, and they were up on the waiting list. They came in because their son had shot somebody in a holdup, and he was going to jail for the rest of his life. And the thing that was important to this particular couple was they were upper middle class, and they were having to sit with a white guy in this counseling session who they perceived, and maybe rightly so, would think that their kid was some stereotypical inner city thug. And that isn't what happened. They were trying to mourn the loss of the child that they had poured their lives into. And the distance between us was something I could never get. It was one of the most, 3 sessions. The man's pastor made him come back. They spent 3 sessions yelling at me. And I sat and listened, and I tried desperately to try to explain that I could try to understand their point of view. But it was really just another reminder, much like St. Mary's Cemetery, of this gap that existed between me and somebody else. So those are the things that shape my worldview. Now, in terms of all these concepts, right, most of the major religions cover them in some significant way. Empathy, compassion, cooperation, providing opportunity. These are not unusual messages in organized religion. Maybe the question is, can we see them embedded in ourselves in some meaningful way? And what I'd like to do is listen to a couple minutes of Radiolab about some brain imaging that sort of shows that it actually is. And so I'll start with the first part of the experiment and explain it, and then we'll draw it up because the second part, the other person can explain better. So if you ask people, and you put them in a neuroimaging machine, and you ask people, you give them a dilemma. You say to them, you're up on a bridge. In front of you is a lever. Down below you are 4 men working on a railroad track. An oncoming train is coming towards them. If you throw that switch, the train will go off the track to another track and run over somebody else, one person, and save the 4 on the track. Now, when you ask this question in the neuroimager, the brain is very clear. A calculating part of your brain says 4 to 1, throw the switch. Throwing the switch doesn't require you to do much of anything, right? You're just throwing a switch. When you change the dynamic and you say to somebody, well, you can save those 4 people if you push this guy off the bridge. So now you have to do something. Another part of the brain lights up. Your inner chimp, your most basic part of you, and says, no, no, that's wrong. There's no calculation that offsets that. So there really are parts of the brain that are engaged in our both trying to calculate what's right and very basic instincts about right. So if we open this up, can you open up this clip and take us out to the 22nd minute? Now, they then proceeded to ask the classic MASH question.
This is Clara from Manassas, Virginia. Radiolab is supported by Plume, publisher of Jeff Bridges and Bernie Glassman's The Dude and the Zen Master. 2 longtime friends take on the importance of doing good in a difficult world. Available wherever books are sold.
You are listening to
Radiolab.
Hi, I'm Robert Krulwich.
And I'm Jad Abumrad.
This is Radiolab. In this hour, we're going to examine a sense of moral...
Take us out. And so I'll open this up. So you have that very basic one where you have 2 sides of the brain that light up, either the calculating one or the very basic part of the brain that's trying to answer this moral question. Well, they made the story more complex. Has anybody ever seen the last episode of MASH? The last episode of MASH.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Can you pause that for a second? So in the last episode of MASH, somebody smothers their baby to save the rest. All right, this becomes a much more difficult moral question. Would you smother your own baby to save a whole village and yourself? And your choices are either smothering your baby, or you and the baby and the village are going to be discovered anyways and everybody's going to be killed. Difficult. So when you look at the brain, you pose that question to them, right? You have your inner chimp, your most basic thing that told you don't push that guy off the bridge, and you have the calculating part of your brain that's saying 1 to 4, 1 to 4, 1 to 4, right? Now they're saying 1 to the whole village, 1 to the whole village, and the basic part of the brain saying, kill my baby? So let's listen to what they see.
I didn't mean for him to kill it. I just wanted it to be quiet. It was a baby. She smothered her own baby.
What Josh did is he asked people the question, would you murder your own child while they were in the brain scanner? And at just the moment when they were trying to decide what they would do, he took pictures of their brains. And what he saw, the contest we described before, was global in the brain. It was like a world war. That gang of accountants, that part of the brain was busy calculating. A whole village could die, a whole village could die. But the older and deeper reflex also was lit up, shouting, don't kill the baby. No, don't kill the baby. Inside, the brain was literally divided. Do the calculations. Don't kill the baby. Do the calculations. Two different tribes in the brain literally trying to shout each other out. And Jed, this was a different kind of contest than the ones we talked about before. Remember before, when people were pushing a man off of a bridge, overwhelmingly their brains yelled, no, don't push the man. And when people were pulling the lever, overwhelmingly, yeah, pull the lever.
Right.
There it was distinct. Here, I don't think really anybody wins.
Well, who breaks the tie? I mean, they had to answer something, right?
That's a good question. And now, is there a... what happens? Is it just two cries that fight each other out, or is there a judge?
Well, that's an interesting question, and that's one of the things that we're looking at.
When you are in this moment with parts of your brain contesting, there are two brain regions.
These two areas here, towards the front.
Right behind your eyebrows, left and right.
Yeah, keep playing, right out to 26 there.
That light up. And this is particular to us. He showed me a slide.
It's those sort of areas that are very highly developed in humans as compared to other species.
So when we have a problem that we need to deliberate over, the light, the front of the brain, this is above my eyebrow, sort of?
Yeah, right about there.
And there's two of them, one on the left and one on the right.
Bilateral.
And they are the things that monkeys don't have as much of that we have.
Certainly these parts of the brain are more highly developed in humans.
So looking at these two flashes of light at the front of a human brain, you could say we are looking at what makes us special.
So that's a fair statement.
A human being wrestling with a problem, that's what that is.
Yeah, where it's both emotional, but there's also a sort of a rational attempt to sort of sort through those emotions. Those are the cases that are showing more activity in that area.
So in those cases, when these dots above our eyebrows become active, what are they doing?
Well, he doesn't know for sure, but what he found is in these close contests, whenever those nodes are very, very active, it appears that the calculating section of the brain gets a bit of a boost, and the visceral inner chimp section of the brain is kind of muffled.
No!
The people who chose to kill their children, who made what is essentially a logical decision, over and over, those subjects had brighter glows in these two areas and longer glows in these two areas. So there is a definite association between these two dots above the eyebrow and the power of the logical brain over the inner chimp or the visceral brain.
Well, that's the hypothesis. So it's going to take a lot of more research to sort of tease apart what these different parts of the brain are doing, or if some of these are just sort of activated in an incidental kind of way. I mean, we really don't know. This is all very new.
And how many people chose to kill their baby?
About half.
Okay,
Wow.
you can pause it here.
That's not bad.
What do you mean slip?
So he says it's not bad because he's thinking, oh boy, the village is saved, right? That's the logical. But when you can start to see these things in the brain, you have to wonder, are some of these morals embedded in us in some meaningful way? Right? Rather than just taught to us. So, just to wrap this up a little bit, I don't have a specific research project to present you, but I'll tell you a little bit about what I've done as quickly as I possibly can because you've been very patient. So, for my work life, I've done things like working with 6 to 11-year-olds who have been psychiatrically hospitalized in Passaic, New Jersey. Now, if you know anything about mental health work, to be 6 to 11 years old and to be psychiatrically hospitalized means that you have some very significant problems. Most of these kids were Latino. This was one of my first jobs out of college. I loved this job. Every day going into work with these kids was something special. I went from there, I was up in Vermont, I created wraparound services for some of the most difficult kids. This was a Robert Wood Johnson project. Wraparound is now a very common event and a very popular event. When I did it, it was one of the first sites that did it in the nation. And these were kids, the first two kids I brought back, one kid was a kid that liked to mutilate animals and molest others. And another kid liked to set fires. So very, very difficult kids. Even these kids were kids I remember fondly in some meaningful way. It was not hard to empathize with how they got to their place and how cruelly they were going to be treated for the rest of their lives and how mean they might be to others as well. I've partnered with a number of communities over mental health services in general in an attempt to provide better services for both African Americans and Latinos. And one of the most interesting jobs I ever had in Georgia was somebody found my name and decided that I might be good enough to sit with people who were exiting out of very long hospital settings for developmental disabilities out into community settings. And these were incredibly tense meetings where families and service providers were at odds with each other over an adult who had never been out of a hospital and may have an IQ of a 40. In terms of my own research and what do I do today, my dissertation was in Mexico where I looked at subsistence farming villages and helped them work through a way to better improve both education and health as well as agricultural outcomes for them. I've spent a number of years studying federal welfare poverty policies and their effects on day-to-day lives. I usually don't look at them from a policy perspective. For that particular research, I spent 2 years in the field doing individual interviews with 200 people living in rural settings across the state of Georgia. I drove to every one of these and spent hours with each one of these clients and talked to them about their lives in some empathetic way. I do work still around immigrants and refugees and overcoming language barriers. I'm very interested in organizational biases and provider biases that create health disparities for African Americans. Right now, my latest work has been focusing on increasing the life expectancy for people with serious mental illness and comorbid health problems. And anybody that doesn't know that population at all, they live 25 years less on average than the general population. They have a life expectancy of people in Central Africa. So I've had a commitment in both work and research to social justice that has had some basis in religion, but very little to do with Jesus. Now, why should you care? Well, you could take my point of view because it helps you. Empathy is incredible. To spend time thinking, what would I want to have done for me? And then proceeding to do that for others. And I think my only leap in faith here is the bottom one. Generally, I'm then hoping against all odds that others will follow. Or you can do it because your brain's going to tell you to do it, or you're already built to do it. Or you can do it because Jesus told you to do it, remembering you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. For me, the reason for believing in social justice seems less important than the hard work of actualizing social justice. Thank you very much.
All right, we are going to take about a half hour for questions. And I'm just going to begin with a couple to give you an opportunity to text in your own questions or write them down on the note cards that have been circulated. And so while you're doing that, we'll begin our discussion here together. The first question I want to ask both of you gentlemen has to do with sort of the inverse of the question of the night. So the question of the night has been, how does your faith or how does your worldview impact, inform your commitment to social justice and the kind of work you do in the university in terms of research with respect to social justice? The inverse would be, how has your work on behalf of social justice challenged your beliefs in any way, in any instance, or maybe on a more fundamental level. But how has the work itself challenged your worldview, challenged your beliefs? And we'll start with Dr. Tate and then go to Dr. Larrison.
Right, that was a really hard question. So much of my research in the last 15 years has focused on sort of geospatial arrangements, and what you see in these arrangements are how people engage with one another, how they build community, etc. And in many of the places I've studied, St. Louis being one, you saw in the maps, and in other municipalities, what I see on a consistent basis are the artifacts of federal, state, and local policies that have led to hypersegregation. And it has been an ongoing policy strategy. If we look at federal policy from, the early 1900s, and when I look at it, I think one of the great frustrations is when I see it actualized in the church. And so I expect exceptionality, and the extent to which I have noticed more recently younger generations actually excelling at being intentional about creating community that is broader demographically than they may have grown up with. That frustration is turning to excitement. I still hold out hope for those who have been enculturated in prior generations, but I am extremely excited about the younger generation and what they're doing in the context of church and breaking down barriers across all kinds of groups. And so it's both frustration and excitement at the same time.
Professor Larrison?
Yeah, I feel like I don't win very often. When you go out to do some of the work that I do, very few moments are like the moment that I had in that office with that Chinese woman. That's the exception. It seems like defeat is the norm of the day. Disparities for African Americans, and particularly African American men living in rural settings who have serious mental illness, remain in place. No matter how hard I charge at it, no matter how angry I am at meetings about it, no matter how much research I do about it, it seems to move very little. And I guess that's my frustration. But it's not a frustration that's unfamiliar, I don't think. To be engaged in any social justice, one can only well imagine what the days of Mother Teresa were like, and how that was a day that might have been filled with defeat. But she never really viewed it that way, I don't think. The engagement itself meant something, and it meant maybe winning on that day. But I wish, in my heart of hearts, that periodically that scene in the Department of Family and Children's Services happened more often.
So a second question then that's somewhat related to this. So Dr. Tate has said here that Jesus is very much at the center of his work and why he does what he does. And Professor Larrison has said it doesn't really have that much to do with Jesus. I'm wondering, for both of you, what it would take to change your position, to change your mind. And maybe we'll go the opposite way. So we'll start with Professor Larrison.
So you're going to start with me.
If you would like, I can start.
I thought a lot about this question because this really threw me off. That idea of going back, it's very difficult, right? And from a standpoint of anybody that's a Catholic out there, Pope Francis is really appealing. That drawback, it's almost seductive. He's talking social justice. All right. So it's been interesting to think a lot about this question of what would it take me to draw back. And I thought maybe that's not the best question, or maybe that's not quite the right question. And maybe the question ought to be that and the reason first of all, the likelihood of me suddenly believing in God, I honestly believe I would have to have a Saul to Paul conversion. That God himself or herself would have to come out of the sky and speak to me in that kind of direct manner. And being the humble individual that I am, that seems highly unlikely. So given that that's probably not going to happen, maybe the better question is, if I did, if for some reason I had a conversion, would all of a sudden the way I view social justice change in some meaningful way? And I thought about this long and hard, and my answer to myself was, not really. And I took something hard. So let's take gay marriage. Would my beliefs about gay marriage as a social justice issue change if all of a sudden I decided, boy, I do believe very strongly in Jesus, and I'm willing to go back to the Catholic Church and follow their doctrine on this? No. I'd do what most Catholic Americans do. I'd say, although the doctrine's very interesting, and I still believe in the Catholic Church and Jesus, I also am willing to believe that gay marriage is okay. So I think that maybe is the interesting question. Would my underpinnings, if you change that underpinning at all, does that change who I am? And I don't see it. And that's why I sort of said at the end, I'm not really overly concerned about why you're pursuing social justice, just that you are. So.
Dr. Tate.
That's a straightforward question for me. If Jesus is a fiction, it's a wrap. I mean, if this wasn't real, if there wasn't an evidentiary base that linked us to his life and sacrifice, teachings, then there would be no sense in me talking like this.
So in some way to be convinced that it was a pure fiction would be what it would take.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to start to field questions now from the audience. And the way this is working, it's very high tech, and this is a little odd for me. But you are texting. The texts are being received over here. And then the questions are being written out in a Google Doc and wired to me and put on my lap. And so, so that's how this works. So if it seems like I'm struggling to articulate the question, it's because I am struggling to articulate the question. Text does not typically translate very well into conversation. So, Dr. Tate, the first question I have here on my lap asks you to do some comparative work. The question is, can you compare your worldview to a different worldview? And then to show how Christianity is the normative guide in social justice. So if I try to reflect on that question a little bit, I think part of what is being asked here is something along the lines of, is Christianity necessary to a vision for social justice? And or are there other worldviews that could supply an approach to social justice?
So how much time do we have?
30 seconds.
Okay. I teach a class, Sociology of Ed. I generally describe to my students 3 worldviews. There's a biblical Christianity. You have secular humanism, which is predominant, in my opinion, in what is articulated in most of social sciences. And you have, if you've had any kind of course on Western civilization, you have a Marxist perspective that would clearly be part of what you would learn in Western Civ. So I don't know how much detail they want me to get into in terms of this, but secular humanism is obviously dominated by in terms of its theology, it is a religion in my opinion. It's a religion that believes in, sort of the empirical, the material and the like, But it's almost a faith in that, that we can guide and generate enough information, empirical data, to help us to some utopia of some sort. Many of us are influenced by this. I mean, I'm obviously influenced by it because I'm a social scientist, and while my questions are predominantly about who is my neighbor and why, I'm still trying to operate out of a biblical Christianity perspective. Most certainly the empirical aspects and the tools we use were created by secular humanist scientists. But my point is, there is a difference. The secular humanist perspective does literally look for the material empirical evidence to bear, whereas biblical Christianity, while the material is important, while evidence is important, there is a faith element that does not exist necessarily in the secular humanist perspective. Secular humanism is a worldview in that there is a perspective on biology, which is largely associated with Darwinism and evolutionary thought, and that evolutionary perspective is then applied in psychology. So if you read a psychology study, you had the brain scan study up, or we heard it. I mean, they might conclude that this is how the brain has evolved over time, building off a Darwinian theory. And it translates all the way through anything that I call theologies, biology, psychology, sociology, and the like in this evolutionary thought is predominant. Biology is a strong, strong influence on secular humanist thought, in my opinion. How many did they tell me I had to go through? Do I have to go through Marxism?
No, you don't. I would just,
so
it's very strong here because in the scientific world, there are very few strong paradigms left. So evolution that drives biology remains an incredibly strong paradigm that has almost a theological or religious theme.
I mean, people believe in it as it's a faith as well. Because they can't see some of the things, but that's I don't really want to go there right now. But
no, I mean, you definitely don't want to be the biologist that shows up today and says, I don't believe in evolution.
That would not work well.
No, you wouldn't go to tenure here.
Not at the University of Illinois, I don't think so. No. But and then the other was a question about normative. Could you?
Well, I think it was a part of the same question, but it again had to come back to is Christianity necessary to a view towards social justice? Is it integral to?
Sure. I tried to conclude my remarks by saying that it is feasible to have a perspective on the world that would allow you to examine issues of justice outside of a Christian perspective. I do believe that is the case. However, I also tried to point out that it's not to be assumed that whatever perspective you have gravitated to has attended to matters of justice, and you need to be very careful about what you latch on to, because you may latch on to something that's very much in opposition to any notions of justice, even those that you laid out in your empathy, compassion, and the like. There are many perspectives that really that is not the case. They are inwardly focused about you and your own advancement individually. It's like making yourself better, and it's not really about others around you per se. And I think those have sort of a New Ageist kind of feel, and many of those don't. They don't necessarily have to deal with a justice perspective.
Okay.
So I think you need to be really careful.
Okay.
Learning and labor, right?
Right. All right, and there's another question here that relates to the learning and labor theme, but I have a question here for Professor Larrison that is put really bluntly, but
I like blunt questions.
and I'll read it as it's stated, but if I think the kind of spirit behind it is maybe not as blunt as the question sounds. So the question simply is, would you push the man? Would you kill the baby? Would you pull the lever? But I think the spirit. But I think the spirit of the question has to do with. I mean, you presented us with some very, very difficult sort of ethical dilemmas, right? And they're, these, as you said yourself. I mean, you described them as sort of universal part of the human condition. I mean, that we face these kinds of ethical dilemmas. They seem to be strongly linked to our brains and to biology and these kinds of things. But maybe the question behind the question here is just for you to elaborate a little bit on how the perspective you presented us tonight might help us work through such ethical dilemmas. In addition to empathy and compassion and cooperation, but actually to kind of work our way through those kinds of profound ethical dilemmas, since you gave us several of them tonight. My stomach was churning at points.
And it's great, the two talkers on Radiolab, one of them has a kid, the one that decides there's no way I'm ever going to smother my kid, and the other one doesn't have a kid, and he's the one that says, I feel good about the 50% that said that they were going to smother the kid. And it's funny, they do a follow-up show, I don't know, a year later when the other guy has a kid now, and he asks him, so now you have a kid, would you smother the baby? And he still says yes. So I think that these ethical dilemmas don't have an answer, and some ethical dilemmas don't. And that may be at the heart of maybe all problems with a worldview, is that they don't answer all questions in some meaningful way. But it does seem like, as you look at this kind of evidence, that there is something within us that tries to answer them and to try to balance out the calculating part of us and the very visceral part of us that responds to things in an emotional way. In terms of the very blunt question, would I push the guy off the bridge? I wouldn't do that one. I don't know if I could be brave enough to push the guy off the bridge to save the four. I think that my inner chimp, my very visceral part of me, would prevent me from doing that, and I perceive that very strongly. I don't know about the baby. I have two kids who I love dearly. and that seems like a very different question. My hope, much like the last speaker that it would be, is that maybe my calculating part does come forward, and that maybe the moral question is to do something terrible, or what seems terrible. So, and I think maybe even with both of these things, the question that neither one of these experiments answers, that we all have to deal with, is, which are you willing to live with? Right? And could you live with pushing somebody off a bridge, touching them, seeing them, committing the murder, even if it meant 4 other people lived? And that calculation would be something that you would have to live with throughout your whole life. And I suspect that unlike this experiment where there's one moment that calculation goes on, or appears to go on in the neuroimaging, that it's a calculation that's redone throughout your whole life. So I don't know.
Okay.
And I'm not dead sure that any faith or worldview tells us which one is the best.
Okay.
But I love that question.
Yeah. So in some ways it connects to a question here for Professor Tate that has to do with the learning. You talked about learning and labor. And you talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you talked about the Samaritan. Well, I'll just read the question. The parable, it just went blank on me. But the parable of the Good Samaritan implies, the questioner states here, that religion and learning is no predictor of a godly heart. And the question is, can you comment?
I think that should be obvious to anyone who has ever studied anything, religion, whether you're an athlete and you're being trained in a certain way. It is quite feasible to know something and not live it out. And so I think that is absolutely on point. And but I don't want to come across as if not. I mean, knowing is an important step. Saturating your mind and building a rich understanding, in my opinion, of the scriptures is more likely to lead to you accidentally finding them and then living them out. So it's really yes, it's feasible to know and not do, but what I would encourage people to do is to learn and attempt to apply. Just like we would an athlete, I can teach you how to dribble. You might forget how to do it in the game, but you know, we see that all the time. I've been watching Illinois basketball, but you know, but it's feasible that you have learned something, but you don't apply it rightly or in the right context, etc. And so I believe knowledge is extremely important, and I do not want to minimize it, but I think that's a great question, and they're absolutely on point with that.
Question for Professor Larrison, and then we have a couple that seem to be more general ones for both of you gentlemen, so we'll get to those here in a second. But the question for Professor Larrison is this: is there a moral obligation to pursue social justice? If so, where does it come from? That's the question.
So moral is a loaded word. It implies, it comes close to implying something religious in some way. Do we have an imperative to do the things that I laid out? Empathy, compassion, cooperation, opportunity. I think it's not really an obligation. I think we're built towards this. I think it's who we are as human beings. I think when we're given the opportunity, we do pursue those lines, regardless of who or what is driving you to get there. And I would argue that pieces like the imaging piece are going to take us to a place where maybe we start to see and understand what the biological basis is for these things and these behaviors. The question for me becomes a little bit more difficult when you look at those people that don't seem to have any empathy or compassion or cooperation, right? And you have to start to ask yourself, if this is something embedded in who we are, why doesn't it appear in everyone? Why do we see people do evil things? Why do we see people that are absolutely unempathetic to others? And that, I think, is the question that drives both the secular humanists and those people who are in religion in some meaningful way, is to try to understand that. And for those people, given that I believe that some of this is embedded in who we are, it's there. The environment didn't bring it out. It was misshapen. It wasn't given the opportunities. And maybe our job is to go back, and not some moral obligation, but again, out of maybe a very selfish place that makes the world better for me and my kids and for everybody around me that I care about, that we help those people regain the biological underpinning that drives us to be empathetic and compassionate and cooperative.
Okay. So this question is for both of you, it states, what is the biggest obstacle hindering the establishment of justice in society, and how ought it to be most effectively addressed? Stumper, whoever wrote that. Maybe we could think of a major obstacle.
So if you look at the prisoner's dilemma, I think one of the biggest obstacle that seems to confront us all is communication. The minute that you get to sit down in front of somebody else and to communicate with them is the minute that we get closer to cooperation and deciding, boy, I'd rather spend a month in jail together than spending 10 years gambling whether or not you're going to rat me out, right? But if I don't ever get to communicate with you, I might start to assume the worst about who you are. And so I think that remains still one of the biggest obstacles. And you can imagine in a world where communication has gotten a gazillion times better than it was in 1983, when I showed up at college with the best typewriter that money could buy. All right? The next year, Apple was out. All right? So, Communication has gotten 1,000 times better, but it is very difficult for us to empathize with people in Central Africa living in a constant state of war, even if I can see the pictures and read the paper, without ever having some face-to-face time with them and really knowing what this is about. So I think that's one of our biggest obstacles. And although we've made great progress, I still wonder how are we going to do even better around this?
So I think it depends on your worldview. I think if you are, and I think you provide a sort of a secular humanist perspective on that we are generally decent people, and if we're shaped, the environment shapes us in a certain way, then things will go well. I begin with the presupposition that men and women inherently are wrongdoers. And left to the environment, they will only intensify in that. And that it is not sufficient to be around other quote-unquote good people, and that's going to, help shape you, per se. I think that there is a deep internal struggle about right and wrong within every human being. And if you don't have something that's going to get a handle on that, and I'm not talking about the mentally ill right now, because I know that was one of the examples, and I want to make sure people don't think that's what I'm making reference to, but I think, let's assume that a person is cognitively normal by psychological standards, and we're going to use secular humanist talk. But the reality is there is a struggle, and in the context of that struggle, something has to happen for you to turn from the wrongdoings that you are inherently, I believe you're right, wired with. They're in you. And so we agree on that. I mean, I do believe there are inclinations that we're wired toward, some good, some bad. And it's a struggle. And what turns a person from that, I do not believe is the physical shaping that we can see or material. That is my worldview. I believe it is something inherently spiritual, and I believe it is literally, it is a spiritual turning. And you literally are not... you're given a different way of thinking about the world, and you strive and you try to put on a different kind of mind in order to handle that. And I think that is the major obstacle. Absent that, I'm not confident that we're going to see the kind of justice that people may be aspiring to in any domain of society. There has to be some acceptance of your insufficiency to do right and the need for something much greater to bring you to a sufficient state of towards things that are good. And without that, I just don't believe that it will change.
Well, it's 8:50, and we were to go to 8:30. However, I would like to give both of our guests just a couple minutes each to say anything else you want to say as we come to a close tonight. So, Professor Larrison, why don't you get us started here?
I'll just thank you very much. This has been, and Bill, thank you. This has been an incredible conversation. Ned, thank you very much. This really has been. It's, I think more of these conversations need to happen. I think that they bring us all to a place that we start to think a little bit more about social justice in some meaningful way and how to apply it in our lives and how to even make meaning out of that, right? So it's been an enlightening experience, and I really appreciate all the questions as well as both the questions from Ned and the presentation from Bill. I think I go home thinking more tonight about my worldview.
So when I first became a professor, I was involved in math education. I never would have imagined an opportunity to come to a major research university, such as the University of Illinois, and to actually be having a conversation with a colleague about justice and a worldview and God or not, and just to actually be able to do that is so unique, and it's unfortunate to me that in American education you have to have a special forum put on by an external body to actually do that. Because these places used to be where we had those conversations all the time. And it's just my hope that this doesn't become a special kind of interaction. It becomes the norm in American universities again.
Well, I want to give us an opportunity here to thank both of our speakers with some applause. But before we do that, you have been given a card, a kind of questionnaire survey card, and we would very much like for you to fill that out as it would help with the planning of future events. And I can't recall if there's something else I was supposed to say. That's it? Okay. So let's thank both of our guests.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.